Companions in romance, playable races, game scope, the impact of your decisions, and more in a series of interviews that have taken place after the developer direct. Obsidian has opened up quite a bit about Avowed. How is it going, everybody? My name is DeMarco, and if you're into fantasy RPGs, you're in the right place. Avowed has me intrigued. I'm excited to learn more about this game. I think the developer direct did a good job of setting up some of it, but there's still more in order to win over a lot of players, and thankfully there's been a solid drip of information coming through interviews that have taken place after the event. And we're going to be covering some of the main highlights of these in today's video, starting off with companions and romance. If you like getting a little bit naughty with your companions in some of these RPGs, games like Baldur's Gate 3, for example, have done a pretty good job of it. Unfortunately, that's not going to be a possibility in Avowed. Obsidian has confirmed that there's going to be no romances in the game, stating, quote, "If you're going to do it, you really have to commit and make sure that you're giving all to fulfilling that in a way that feels both true to the character, but also creates an engaging player experience. So not something we're doing for Avowed, but I wouldn't say never." Basically saying if you're gonna half-ass a mechanic in your game, you might as well not put it in and just focus on the other areas that you want to do very well. And a key highlight of everything we're gonna be talking about today circles back to the idea of focus. Now, obviously, when you keep talking over and over about how you're trying to focus on specific elements, that can lead to its own set of problems, which we are going to discuss later on in the video. But as far as relationship with your companions go, it's not going to happen. I'm not personally someone who really cares too much about dating characters in a game. One good example where it's intrinsically woven into the narrative, something like The Witcher 3, where Yennefer vs. Triss is a pretty integral part of Geralt's story in that game. I would also say Mass Effect is one of the only other games I've really cared about romances in it, but I would much rather have just well-written companions, the character themselves and their personal growth and their personal arc that players could relate to, and you could pick your favorites. I think exactly to that example of Mass Effect. I think of characters like Mordin. I think of characters like Legion, Grunt, and Rex. You're not getting relationships with these characters, and yet they're constantly held up as some of the best in the Mass Effect franchise. Anyway, we've seen systems get implemented into some games, and it hasn't really worked out, and as a result, the game gets critiqued. A recent example that actually comes to mind is something like Starfield with its space flight mechanics. Starfield with its flight mechanics on paper sounded really cool. I love that they were borrowing elements from FTL, but when you actually got into the game, is one of the larger critiques that players had was it felt like a glorified loading screen. But a lot of other players would have been perfectly okay if Bethesda had just done a Mass Effect style system traveling between planets and focused mostly on the boots of the ground exploration that Bethesda does very well. So ultimately, I'd rather Obsidian not phone it in here with the romance options and the companions, but there's a lot more information to go through. For example, companions will never leave you throughout your journey through the Living Lands. This was an interesting one. I imagine if I hated somebody so very much, but the quest at hand was so important, would I stick with them? And there's an argument to be made that companions sticking by you, even if you do absolutely everything that they hate, yet still at the final sequence, at the final battle, the final moment of the game, that companion is still by your side because the mission is just too dang important. Honestly, that could be set up for some really interesting encounters and some really interesting dialogue to happen. If they really want to take it to the next level, Obsidian could even have the NPC try to sabotage you. They stay with you because they don't think you're going to do the right thing. You get to that final moment and then they stab you in the back because you can't be trusted. Not saying that'll happen, it's just me and let my brain go wild, but be pretty cool to experience. Obsidian explained that they didn't want to have this binary system to how companions work. This left meter means you did bad, and going to the right means you did good, and you have to influence companions one way or the other. They said specifically, quote, "You can influence how the companions tackle their respective personal struggles, and the companions in turn will try to nudge the player around the decisions and outcome that they think are best, rightly or wrongly." I'm not for or against this type of system in a game, having a meta game always in your mind where you're thinking, all right, well, my companion like this, well, they not like this, and you just have to realize the consequences, which leads for a lot of players to save scumming if they make the wrong choices anyway. How many people reloaded the game after this moment to try to do it better?
Got to do this my way.
Me. I did. I'll admit it. The one concern I think I might have is if every NPC is sort of, or every companion is sort of going to feel like the way they did in Starfield, they're all just generally good guys. It doesn't play, if you wanted to play the space pirate in Starfield, well, there's no character or companion that's really going to get along with you that much. And with Obsidian emphasizing how important companions are and how their stories are woven into the main quest at hand and your journey through the Living Lands, it's going to be pretty important, especially when they want you to be able to play your way and have the level of consequence that they want in the game, to have companions that at least can reflect the type of character you're trying to play as. Similar to the Outer Worlds, you can have two companions joining you along on the journey at a single given time. You could issue them some light commands, but you're not really metagaming and planning out where they go. Something like, for example, Baldur's Gate 3. And there are a few instances where you need to include a particular companion, but not always. It's usually however they might have expertise in a certain field or a certain area, and that's why they come along. Like it or hate it, it seems like Obsidian in that regard is going for more of a linear styled experience. Of course, it's still very, very open, but in those specific few cases, however many they may be. I can't really say I'm a fan of this decision, especially if it's going to be tied to the main quest specifically, depending on how heavily it's used. I think back to something like Mass Effect, for example, where you could choose which companions, and it was always fun to do another playthrough bringing along different companions to hear what dialogue they had to say or their opinions on certain things. And if you're forced in certain moments to bring Kai around, then But who knows, it might be 2 missions in the whole game where this happens, so I'm not judging it now. So next up, we learned a little bit about why there's 2 races only in the game. This might come as a bit of a disappointment, especially when the first companion and one of the major players in Avowed was Kai, who is a race called Amawa? Aumeowa. How many Pillars of Eternity fans did I just piss off? In Avowed, you only have the option to play as a human or an elf, and this was explained for lore reasons. You're coming from the Adir Empire, and those are typically the ones who are either in power or the majority race that is there. Obsidian also cited technical reasons why this isn't the case. For example, first-person camera perspective, if you are playing as a dwarf, it's not just a matter of lowering the camera closer to the ground. You have to consider things like weapon and reach and movement speed and those types of aspects as well. As a result, I do hope that the race that you pick plays a little bit more of an impact in the story. Instead of having 7 different races, you have only 2 to pick from, and therefore it could have a bigger influence on certain dialogue choices or the consequence in the game, those sorts of elements. Between this and the lack of romance options, I could see a lot of folks coming back and saying that, well, Obsidian isn't trying that hard and they're being lazy and they should be putting all these elements in the game. Again, it does come back to that target word I mentioned, which is focus, but that leads into what could potentially be a big problem for Avowed as well. When things become all about focus, and we're constantly hearing about how companions are a major focal point of the game and we want to write them really well, the world space we're going with smaller. We scaled down from that Skyrim open world RPG to focus on what we do really well, which is the choice and consequence, the moral grayness, and all those other aspects. But it does just mean they really need to get those aspects right. And for me, when I am playing these types of RPGs, it's how much do my choices have an impact on the world, and if they feel a bit insignificant, then Avowed's really going to miss the mark for a lot of people. In my developer direct showcase analysis of Avowed, I talk a little bit about how the choice and consequence example that they gave during the direct really didn't satisfy what I was looking for, and it could go a number of different ways, so we need to see exactly how these choices fan out once you make them. Thankfully, we do have a couple things to talk about in relation to that today. A lot of games that have been mentioned in relation to Avowed's development are positive inspirations. In fact, Carrie Patel explicitly called out Mass Effect 2's Legion loyalty mission as inspiration as far as the non-black and white moral grayness choices go. She mentions, quote, "Our approach to choice and consequence is to eschew a black and white good versus evil morality scale, where the moral balance of your decision is very obvious, but rather something that feels closer to life, where sometimes it's not obvious or sometimes the right choice feels obvious, but the outcome can be surprising, justified, but surprising. There's also been references that players will not find absolutely 100% of everything in Avowed, which says good things to me. I always like to hear that because it's a little bit rewarding when you always go back for a second playthrough, find those mystery items that you didn't notice were in the game before. You get different perspectives that change how you feel about certain quests or certain characters in the game. That's one of the elements I liked about the Outer Worlds quite a bit. And then finally, as far as the scope of the game, there's some comments that we have heard in the past. We've heard how this is no longer Obsidian's take on Skyrim, but it's more similar to the Outer Worlds. And Carrie mentioned specifically that there is an appetite for large, massive open world games. That's absolutely there, but she also says that for her, the games that hit the hardest in terms of a really good role-playing experience are not so open. You end up feeling adrift as a player. It shouldn't be like, this is a wonderful sandbox, but I'm just building my own sandcastles here without a larger sense of purpose or identity. I'm inclined to agree. There's been many games that you hop into these beautiful looking worlds and then you end up just wandering around a bit mindlessly. It's happened to me even with Bethesda games where I take a break, I leave for a bit. Yeah, I have a quest log miles long of all things that I can go off and do, but ultimately I just sort of feel like, well, what am I really doing here? Especially with Bethesda's games going more into this mentality of creating, they've always sort of been sandbox worlds to play in, and you have all these different things to go off and explore, but I feel like Bethesda over the past few years has drifted more and more into that side of things, where it used to be this RPG with a lot of quests and stories and adventures and dungeons to go in, and now it's more of a sandbox with some RPG things you can do. Apparently I forgot to record an outro, so here we are. The next morning, it's like 7 in the morning, editing this video, and I realized forgot that entirely. I don't even have my phone. I have no idea where it is to change the color of the lights behind me. You need to do it on the app. So anyway, let me know, do you prefer massive, huge open worlds or something more condensed, somewhere in the middle, or a bit of both depending on the mood you're in? Let me know how you're feeling about that, Avowed, about your day, anything. Happy to hear it. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and as always, I hope to see all you dudes next time. So long, everybody.